We are in level 2 evidence this morning. So the public gallery will be closed. Only a few accredited journalists will be allowed into the hearing room whilst evidence is being given. Everyone else will be able to view proceedings in the annex, subject to the 10-minute delay. No one, whether a member of a legal team, an accredited journalist, or members of the inquiry staff, will be permitted to bring electronic devices into the hearing room. This includes mobile phones and smart watches, even if switched off. This is a direction of the chair. The inquiry security team will be able to arrange safe storage of any such devices. Please ask at the security desk. Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Bottle.
Sir, before you have Mr. Ben Mant. Please may the witness be sworn.
Yes.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Please sit down. That's where the microphones are.
Yes. Good morning. My name is Emily Pottle, and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Please, can you state your full name?
Certainly, it's Benjamin, Edward, Arthur, Jonathan, Mant.
You produced 3 statements for this inquiry, I believe. If we could pull them up. The first one is 5669, dated the 12th of March of 2018. It'll be up on the screen in front of you. And if we can turn to the last page, page 14. Do you recognize that statement?
I do recognise that statement.
Yes.
If I could add, though,
Please.
I typed my statement. This is a type of that type, if that makes sense. There's quite a few typing mistakes within the statement, and I hadn't seen this version until very recently. But ostensibly, it's exactly the same as the one that I signed.
Okay.
If they're typing mistakes, don't worry about it, Mr. Mann. Have you got a hard copy there with
Yes.
It looks as if you have.
Yes.
By all means, use that. I mean, what I want is your evidence.
Of course.
You can refresh your recollection from the statement if it's helpful at any time you want.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. And just I'll deal with the rest of the statements now. There's also a statement with reference 5279, dated the 6th of April of 2018, which should be on the screen in front of you, yes. And if we just turn to the last page there, it's just a short 2-page statement.
Yep.
And finally, a statement with the reference 4930, dated the 9th of March of 2018. This is a 1-page statement, in fact.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Those statements were prepared all in 2018. Are they true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, absolutely.
Sir, may those 3 statements be adduced into evidence?
Yes.
Mr. Ment, in March of 2018, you were a police officer employed by Wiltshire Police as a detective inspector, is that right?
That's correct.
And you're now retired, is that right?
That's correct.
Can you tell us what was your rank when you retired?
I was a Detective Chief Superintendent.
I see. On the 4th of March, you were the on-call detective inspector for Wiltshire. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you were called by Detective Superintendent Tim Corner, who tasked you to act as the senior investigating officer in the investigation into the apparent poisoning of the Skripals. And you fulfilled that role from about 10 p.m. on the 4th of March until early the next morning at about 8 a.m. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
You were on, in fact, on all day Sunday on something else, and then all night Sunday on this. Is that it?
That's correct. So I worked a day shift in real terms. I was rostered to do that. And the way we operated call at that moment in time was that you were then on call from when you finished until the following morning.
Got it. Thank you.
So on this occasion, you had perhaps the misfortune of working all day and then having to work all night.
Yes.
On this incident. Can you just tell us briefly what the role of a SIO is?
So the role is set out by what is known as the Murder Manual, which is published by the College of Policing along with the National Police Chiefs Council. That defines the responsibility of the senior investigating officer as being in charge of all elements of an investigation. So you are the decision maker, and you're expected to not only make decisions but record the rationale for your decisions and what are known as policy decisions around what you're going to do and what you're not going to do.
Would it be fair to say that you were in charge of the decisions on the ground, so to speak?
Yes.
On the 4th and 5th of March, Detective Superintendent Corner, he was your superior, is that right?
Yes, so within the sort of hierarchy of policing, there was a gold commander that sat, then there's a silver commander and effectively a bronze tactical commander. So on that night, or across that weekend, Superintendent Corner was the silver, so he was the duty superintendent. I was the on-call senior detective, and as you've mentioned, at the time I was a detective inspector. Mm-hmm. Effectively fulfilling the bronze function.
Yes, okay. So you were bronze, Detective Superintendent Corner, he was silver. And then above him, it would have been Deputy Chief Constable Mills, is that right?
That's correct.
So he would have been the gold.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you now about the briefing you received by Deputy Superintendent Corner. But just before we get to the briefing, by way of background, can I ask whether you had any training in chemical, biological, and nuclear
CBRN.
hazards? CBRN, yes.
So CBRN is briefed to all police officers at a very probably basic level as part of your ongoing training and professional development. I personally not ever had any bespoke training around CBRN. So I had I knew what it was, but I didn't know of any fine detail about our response.
Yes, and we'll hear later on, but there are some officers who receive specialist training in CBRN. You were not one of those.
No.
You received a call from Detective Superintendent Corner at about 9:22 to inform you about the investigation into the poisoning. And here I'm referring to your statement, pages 1 and 2. So
Yes.
please refer to if it helps you. So you received a call from Detective Superintendent Corner at just after 9. Can you tell us, what did he tell you about the incident at that time?
So to begin with, he explained, well, his opening words to me were, this is an unusual one. And by that, an unusual call. So he went on to explain that 2 people had been taken ill in Salisbury, in the Maltings, and it was suspected that it was a fentanyl poisoning at that point, or that moment in time, and that they'd been taken to hospital where they were seriously ill. Then what made it different is he went on to say that we suspected that one of the injured people was Sergei Skripal, and that he was a former Russian spy.
Did he tell you at that stage that the Skripals were not known on police systems? Do you remember?
Yes, we had a conversation, obviously, because that is like a call like no other. I've never experienced anything similar in my career. And I went on to say, what do we know about them? And by that, I meant what was on our Wiltshire databases that were available to us. And he said nothing.
And at that stage, did he tell you that there were 4 crime scenes?
Yes. So, and I know I've referred to them as crime scenes within my statement. I suspect that was with the benefit of hindsight, because I wrote the statement a week or 2 later.
Yes.
I suspect on the night he probably referred to them as scenes, because we didn't know at that time exactly what we were dealing with.
Yes, I see. And those scenes were the park bench, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Where they had been found taken ill. The Skripals' home address,
Yes,
the car that
Yes.
they believe the Skripals had driven that day, and the Skripals themselves, is that right?
correct.
When you took that initial call from Detective Superintendent Corner, what actions did you agree at that stage?
So I realised that on that particular night there was limited investigative inquiries that we could realistically carry out. But the most important to me was around scene preservation, because we were talking, certainly in the case of the Maltings and Mr. Skripal's car, we were talking about scenes that were outside. And then in regard to his home address, we obviously wanted reassurance that that was secure. And regarding them, there's obviously medical evidence that can be obtained at the start of a person being treated that can't be obtained later on. So those are my concerns. And the context of this was that it followed Storm Emma, which had been particularly hard on Wiltshire. So that we'd had very severe snow. There had been parts of the county that had been sort of impassable in the days building up to the 4th. So I was conscious that with scenes that were outside, I didn't want the weather, which was inclement, to impact on their integrity.
And so do you recall discussing with Deputy Superintendent Corner that you would put tents over the bench to protect the bench from the inclement weather?
Of course. So naturally, the SIO wouldn't be expected to know everything about the technicalities of crime scene management. You would go to a crime scene coordinator for that, which is something that I later did. But from my perspective as a detective, I wanted to know that they were secure and that nothing could interfere with their integrity. So the tenting is the traditional approach we would take for a normal scene or crime scene.
Okay. And Detective Superintendent Corner asked you to attend Bourne Police Station and to confer with Nick Bailey, is that right?
That's correct.
And he wanted reassurance that appropriate inquiries had been completed.
Yeah, so obviously Nick was a detective sergeant. I was effectively the next rank up.
Yes.
And therefore, from the perspective of the force, and then by inference the community, the force would have the reassurance that one of the senior detectives had oversight of the inquiry from the early stages.
I see. And do you recall that Detective Superintendent Corner said that he had spoken to Special Branch, was the term he used,
Yes,
and that they were carrying out checks? Do you remember him saying that to you?
absolutely, because as soon as there had been a suggestion that Mr. Skripal may be a spy, that was a natural line of inquiry that could be explored that night.
I see.
And we've heard, Mr. Mant, that at that time, in this context, Special Branch meant a regional unit.
So the Southwest Counter-Terrorism Intelligence Unit.
Thank you.
Yes.
And indeed out of the county.
Yeah, so the structure of that network is that they can access other
Sure.
parts of the security services.
Yep.
Yes. I'll refer to them when I'm asking you questions as special branch.
Sure.
Just less of a mouthful, but, so we understand each other. I'm going to move on now to the briefing you received at Bourne Hill. So you traveled to Bourne Hill Police Station, and you arrived at, I think in your statement, and I'm looking here at page 3, you say you arrived at about 22:45.
Absolutely. It took me longer than I'd have expected to because of the weather. So I had to cross Salisbury Plain, and there were sort of abandoned cars where people had left them. So it was a hazardous journey that took longer than usual.
You were coming from?
I was coming from the centre of the county.
Right.
Once there, you met with Nick Bailey and you asked him for a brief.
That's correct.
And at the briefing, Nick Bailey was present, Inspector Martin, is it Scora?
Scorer.
Scora, yes. Temporary Police Sergeant Tracy Holloway was there. Police Constable Alex Way. And Officer VN 005, he arrived as well for the briefing, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And here I'm still on page 3. The brief began at 22:30. Can you tell us?
It was just slightly later. It was 22:50.
Oh, I see. Pardon me. And can you just tell us what you were told at that briefing?
So PC Way and Sergeant Holloway took me through their recollection of what had happened in the Maltings and how we'd responded to the report of the drugs overdose. They had explained that it had been reported to us by an off-duty nurse and an off-duty doctor who'd come across them. There was clearly serious concern for their welfare. They displayed some quite extreme symptoms and had received treatment at the scene. They also talked through that they'd, as part of trying to help the Scripples, had come across Mr. Scripples' wallet, and that contained his identity, which later led them to be able to carry out those first inquiries that identified Mr. Scripples' background.
I see. And PC Way and Temporary Police Sergeant Tracy Holloway, they were present at the scene, is that right?
Yes.
Is that your understanding?
Yeah, my understanding was PC Way was one of the first officers to arrive. As would be normal, the sergeant responded quite quickly as well because it was clearly going to be something that required a degree of coordination, and Sergeant Holloway had fulfilled that role.
I see. Did they describe to you the symptoms? And please refer to your statement if it helps you.
Sure. They did describe them. So I just want to make sure I recall it as per my statement.
Yes, take your time.
So this is on page 3.
Yes, the penultimate paragraph.
Thank you. So they described that when they'd arrived, Julia Scripple was unresponsive and unconscious. Mr. Scripple was sat on the bench, but not very responsive. It sounded as though he was slightly better than Julia at that particular moment. Some first aid had been carried out to Julia, who had been shaking. The male, Mr. Scripple, then vomited extensively down his front, and I noted that some of that vomit included pasta shapes, which was significant to me at that point, because obviously one of the hypotheses was whether or not they'd been poisoned, as in ingested a food poison, or poison in their food.
I see.
There was also, they talked about Mr. Scripple's pupils, his eye pupils, being pinpricked, which was obviously unusual as well.
Yes, and you understood that to mean that the pupils were very small. Is
Yes.
that right? Okay. At about 11 o'clock, Officer VN 005 interrupted the briefing to give you some specific information.
That's correct.
Can you tell us what that was?
So VN005 was a CBRN tactical advisor, and he'd been listening to the briefing that I'd been leading, and he had from memory, it was like an aide memoir where he'd been ticking off some of the symptoms that would be consistent with a nerve agent poisoning. And he basically said to me, 7 out of 12, indicating that out of 12 classic symptoms for a nerve agent poisoning, the officers, PC Way and Sergeant Holloway, described 7 of them.
I see. If we could just pull up now, I think we'll have that sheet of paper. Reference 5958, page 16.
Yes.
Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do. That was the that aide memoir, in my words, that had been that he referred to.
He says that he handed you that piece of paper. It is a summary of signs and symptoms of chemical agents. And we can see on the left-hand side, it says nerve agents, for example, sarin, early symptoms, pinpoint pupils, which you've just described. You were told that the Skripals had. Running nose, increased saliva, tightness of the chest, difficulty in breathing, later symptoms, headache, and then increased saliva, drooling at the mouth, dizziness and general weakness, excessive sweating, danger symptoms, nausea and vomiting, involuntary urination and defecation, muscles twitching and jerking, stoppage of breathing.
Yeah.
Those ticks that we can see on the left-hand side, and you know, you might not be able to help us with this, but do you think, were they there at the time that he handed you the piece of paper?
Yes.
Okay, and so you described him as ticking off symptoms. Do you think that's what those marks are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you count them, there's more than 7, which is obviously clear. The 7 out of 12, that's how I noted it down in my notebook. I had a major incident notebook at the time, which I know is available to the inquiry. And I'd recorded it as 7 out of 12. But I do remember him showing me that piece of paper.
Yes, okay. VN005, his statement records that he saw the body-worn video of the officers who attended the Skripals on the scene, and he was able to observe their symptoms for himself through that video. Do you recall him telling you that?
Yes, he added that when he was telling me about the 7 out of 12.
Okay. So it wasn't simply that he was listening to the briefing and noticed the symptoms. He had actually seen for himself.
Because some of those symptoms they hadn't described, if that makes sense.
Yes.
But he'd obviously observed it through that body worn. I say obviously, but that's how he recalled it.
Yeah. When VN005 gave you that piece of paper and described his concerns, what was your reaction?
I was extremely concerned, to the extent where I stopped the briefing, because it was a call like no other I'd received at 22 minutes past 9. It was a briefing like no other that I'd personally received when someone had described that level of similarity to a chemical agent poisoning.
So you stopped the briefing. What did you do?
I then phoned Superintendent Corner to relay what VN005 had told me, and yeah, that's what I did.
And what was his response?
So Superintendent Corner basically said that he'd had a similar conversation with VN005 already, and was aware of that. Now, VN005 was our local CBRN tactical advisor, but there is a national CBRN network as well. And one of my inquiries then was I wanted them to be consulted, and Superintendent Corner, like-minded, had started that process. So he was also making contact with people from the national network.
Okay. In your statement, you say that he reassured me, I'm reading here from page 4. He says, he reassured me that he'd already spoken to VN005 and on-call officers at CBRN. He was waiting for further calls, but appeared far less concerned than VN005.
He was, and that was based on the conversations that he had. And obviously I can't comment on those conversations, I didn't have them. But he reassured me because VN005 had raised my anxiety, but he helped to bring them back down, especially combined with the fact that we didn't have anything on our systems about Mr. Skripal.
Well, did Superintendent Corner mention whether Special Branch had called him back?
I believe at that point he did, and I think he confirmed to me that there was no relevant intelligence even, and they hadn't expressed any interest. So I've worked at various times through my career in sort of need-to-know environments, so I understand that sometimes you won't be told things for good reason, but in that context, I took great comfort really that the CT network weren't interested and weren't telling us anything that would raise the sort of risk assessment towards the Skripals.
Mm-hmm. If we can turn, please, to Superintendent Corner's statement,
Yeah,
which is, it'll come up on the screen for you, reference 6163, paragraph 36.
yes. Yeah,
This is his recollection of the call that he had from Special Branch. So he says, at about 10 o'clock, 2200 hours, I believe I had a further call from my Special Branch contact advising that checks had revealed nothing further to assist us with our inquiries. I remember thinking that it was an odd response, which suggested that they could neither confirm nor deny any information that they may have held on the Skripals. I was also informed that they were not going to assign an SIO from their side, presumably a Special Branch's SIO.
yes.
I was advised to run the incident as per normal investigation with a force inspector. To me, at that time, it was inappropriate for the incident to be investigated at this level, especially if it turned out to be an attempted assassination, which I thought was a possibility. So this is not your statement, just so clear for everyone who's following along. This is the statement of Superintendent Corner. Does that accord with your recollection of the conversation you had with Superintendent Corner?
Yes, it does. And what I would add is that I wouldn't have thought it surprising that they would neither confirm nor deny, because for very good reason, the CT network often take that approach. But the comfort I was taking was that if it was something, if they held information that would have changed our course of action or changed my course of action, then they would have told us so that I could use that information within my decision making. So they weren't telling us that. The fact that they weren't appointing or seeking to appoint their own SIO, whilst there is a protocol for that happening, that was also significant, because if CT policing were of the view that it was a CT incident, then they would have wanted to take control at an early stage, albeit there's mechanisms for how that happens. It doesn't just happen on a whim. Mm-hmm. So I took comfort from both those things because it reduced the risk assessment from my perspective.
I see. It seems that Superintendent Corner here is expressing some level of disquiet, though, because he says, to me, it was inappropriate for the incident to be managed at this level. Did you share that disquiet?
No. This was what has been referred to by many as a black swan event. And at the time that this was taking place, we didn't know what we were dealing with. So whilst there were clearly a number of hypotheses, the fact that we had no information to suggest that Mr. Skripal was a spy on police systems, the fact that CT policing weren't raising concern regarding the incident, made me think that it was still okay to be dealt with at force level. Because if there was concerns, then then it would already start to be escalated, and we'd have been made aware of that.
I see. And when you say a black swan event,
Are
black
you-
swans are quite rare.
Yes, a unique event, sorry.
I'm going to take you now to an email from Inspector Gillian Hughes, and that's reference 6149, page 1, please. If we just scroll in on the text from Miss Hughes, so just scroll down just a bit, please. Thank you. This is an email which we've been taken to before. It is an email from Inspector Gillian Hughes in 2021, so sometime after the incident, and she's describing sort of feedback on what difficulties she encountered in the response. And paragraph 2, she refers to the contact with Special Branch, and she says, "The second and longer issue was contacting the on-call Special Branch. If I remember rightly, he was a Gloucester officer. With the information shared, he did not appear to show any interest in what we were concerned about, and from memory was very dismissive and acting totally that we were overreacting, despite concerns from our CBRN TAC, and who had observed the body-worn video and agreed the symptoms were consistent with CBRN reaction, and that the person on the body-worn video appeared to be the same person as identified on the internet. Despite trying to confirm that actions were being completed by SB, he came back and said that SB were not aware that Skripal was housed in Salisbury and that they were not taking any further action. This resulted in me getting Superintendent Coroner to call him direct to discuss. All the delays in confirming who it was concerned it could be CBRN meant that the hospital was not advised of our concerns and subsequently impacting on medical treatment. And she concludes that it was finally agreed with Superintendent Coroner that they could go home that evening and raise it at 7 o'clock. So what Inspector Hughes here seems to be saying is she's criticizing her Special Branch colleagues for not taking seriously their concerns. Did you share her concerns at all?
Well, with the benefit of hindsight and knowing what happened next, I still find it remarkable that Special Branch were not aware that Mr. Skripal was living in Salisbury and were not able to give us any background information regarding Mr. Skripal. As you'll be aware, the majority of the information about Mr. Skripal was gathered from open source searches on the internet. From an investigator's perspective, we wouldn't place a lot of confidence in that because we don't know the source and the provenance. So I would have been far more comforted had we been given a briefing by Special Branch or we'd been given some kind of intelligence report that would have helped framed and put into context Mr. Skripal and his background. There may be good reasons why they hadn't done that. Mm-hmm. I just wouldn't know what they are.
No. Have I understood this correctly? With the benefit of hindsight, obviously, you are critical that they were dismissive. But at the time of the events in question, you thought that there could be some reason why they wouldn't confirm or deny.
No, I don't think so. I took, given what information we were aware of at that time, so given that we were aware that Mr. Skripal and his daughter had been taken seriously ill without fully understanding the reasons why, I felt that if they knew he was a spy, they would have told us. So that was my basis. And had they turned around and said he is a spy and he is living at 47 Christy Miller Road, I'm not sure that would necessarily have changed what happened next. But it would have helped with the decision making because it would have given validity to what we'd seen on the internet.
Mm-hmm. But if now, if we're going back to the night in question, and I appreciate it's difficult to do this, but without the benefit of hindsight, without knowing what happened next, am I correct in understanding that you were comforted by their lack of interest at that time?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to take you now back to the briefing, which had been interrupted when you left to call
Yep.
Superintendent Corner with the information from VN 005. So if we return back to the briefing, which resumed, and I'm looking here at page 4 of your statement. You were told that the paramedics had concerned that the female, who's Julia, had stopped breathing. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do, yes.
Can you remember, and you can look at your statement if it helps you, what else you were told at that stage?
So I was told that the paramedics had administered naloxone. I think I might have been given the manufacturer's name of that as opposed to the naloxone as the form of the drug, which is an opioid receptor. So it's used frequently with people that have overdosed from opiates, and I've seen it used in real life, and it literally brings people back from the dead. So from a decision-making perspective, that took us further down the route of some form of opiate poisoning. Fentanyl had been mentioned earlier. Fentanyl at that time, we'd seen very little of any fentanyl across Wiltshire. So that was new. And I can remember thinking at the time, I need to know more about fentanyl poisoning because I'm sat here thinking I don't know enough about it, albeit that wasn't relevant later.
No.
Sorry, did you say that the hearing about the naloxone having been administered
Yes.
took you further down the opiate?
In my mind, because,
Why was that?
because I guess I was thinking, why would they have administered that
Oh, I see.
if they didn't think? I mean, obviously they were at the scene, they were seeing Sergei and Julia face to face.
Quite.
And they don't, paramedics don't give you drugs for any old reason.
No.
So that to me made me think, or perhaps it was one of these things.
I see.
At that time.
Did you know what the effect or result of the naloxone had been, just that it had been given?
Just that it had been given, and obviously it hadn't been successful in so much as they continued to display severe symptoms. And having seen it work, people recover quite quickly following its administration.
I see.
In the right circumstances.
Mm-hmm. I think we're looking at the third to last paragraph on page 4 of your statement. You say, at some stage before they left, the paramedics had administered naloxone to both parties. This is an opioid receptor and used to reverse the side effects of an opium overdose.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
This has not worked, and that tended to eliminate the possibility of a heroin overdose,
Yeah.
which is one of the more common explanations for people being taken suddenly ill on park bench environments. That's common sense. One of the paramedics had stated that the symptoms on display were consistent with an overdose of fentanyl.
Yeah.
And then you go on to say, Nick and Tracy, who were at the brief, informed me that there was not a known problem with fentanyl abuse in Salisbury. Do you remember being told that?
Yes.
So based on what is here in your statement, that the naloxone hadn't worked and that there wasn't a known problem with fentanyl, is it correct that during this briefing, the information that you were given tended to discount the possibility of a drugs overdose?
Yes. At the time, I think the way I viewed it was that it hadn't worked, but they'd obviously thought that that was the most appropriate treatment, and drugs don't always work. So in my mind, I still had that sort of as one of the clear hypotheses, was that there had been a drugs overdose of some sort. But there were a few things that made that unusual. The open source intelligence had suggested that this was a father and daughter, and thinking back across my policing experience, which isn't as large as some but greater than others, I'd never heard of that before. I'd never heard of a father and daughter overdosing in a public environment like this.
Mm-hmm. So it was unusual.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say then that it was something, the drugs overdose, that you were keeping at the back of your mind?
Yeah, yeah. There was a number of hypotheses, and by that I'm simply saying a number of things that could have happened. And from an investigative mindset perspective, what you try and set about doing is proving or disproving those hypotheses until you get to the point where you've established what's happened. And quite often you'd have a preferred hypothesis out of the range. And at that moment in time, I don't think I knew enough to have a preferred hypothesis.
I see. If we can continue then on to page 5 of your statement, just completing what you were told in that initial brief. Detective Sergeant Bailey confirmed that checks had been carried out on the niche system, which is
Yep.
one of the, will you tell us what is niche?
So the niche is our record management system. We use it to store details of all crime reports, but also all intelligence reports. It had been introduced to Wiltshire Police in 2005. So by 2018, we had a significant amount of information in there. And the reason why it was brought in was so that we had a single version of the truth. Policing historically has had disparate databases, so it make it difficult to research things, but niche gives you that single version of the truth.
Yes, and there was no record
No,
of Sergei or Yulia Skripal on that system.
yeah.
So no police intelligence about them.
Which I
crime
found very
reports.
surprising.
Yes. That's in hindsight, is that?
Yes,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. And also, I know we talked about there only being one database which should contain all the information, but in fact, searches were also conducted on the police national computer.
Yeah, sorry. So one database locally.
Yes.
There's obviously national computer
Yes.
databases, which is the PNC, the Police National Computer, and the PND, the Police National Database.
And those are national systems which
Yeah.
record both intelligence and also convictions and cautions
Yeah,
and the like, and there was no trace of either of them on those.
yeah.
Okay.
And obviously that overcomes the risk that a person might be known outside of Wiltshire that isn't known on Wiltshire systems. That's the purpose of those databases, to link those together.
Checks had also been completed on the vehicle, which was linked to Sergei Skripal, and it was found that the BMW was registered in Sergei's name and Yulia was on the insurance. Is that right?
That's correct.
And a search had established that the vehicle was in the Maltings car park. Is that right?
That's correct.
You made inquiries, or pardon me, you were told that inquiries were made about CCTV. Do you recall what you were told at the briefing about CCTV?
Yes, so Sergeant Holloway was very clear on this. There would have been, or there was and there is, CCTV from that area, but it wasn't available to us overnight, which was a peculiarity at that moment in time and deeply frustrating to the investigation team.
Yes. You were also told that neighbours of the Skripals had been spoken to, and that one of the neighbours had a set of keys for the property. Do you recall
Yep.
that?
Yes, I do, yeah.
And the keys had been retained by the police, and the house was being guarded by officers.
Yes.
Do you recall that? You were also given an update on the Skripals' health.
Yes,
You were told that armed officers were on the ward,
yes,
and that PC Collins, who had been at the scene initially, was at Salisbury District Hospital seizing the clothing. Is that
that's correct, yeah.
Okay. And now, if we can move on, and I'm looking now at page 6 of your statement, the briefing was interrupted a second time by a call from Superintendent Corner. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And what did he tell you?
So he spoke about conversations that he'd had with the national CBRN officers who had told him that it was unlikely that the cause of the Skripal's illness was radiation poisoning, as the symptoms would have taken far longer to manifest themselves. And the reason for that is both myself and Superintendent Corner had considered links to Litvinenko, who tragically died from radiation poisoning, but that was slow onset. So he took a long time to become ill, whereas the Skripals had become ill apparently very quickly.
Did he tell you anything about this cholinesterase inhibition?
Yes. So building on the radiation poisoning is. So he said that they would have suffered hair loss, reddening of the skin, if that had been the case, whereas that wasn't one of the symptoms that had been described.
I see. And the hair loss and the reddening of the skin, that was if they had received radiation poisoning.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
So just for everyone following along, I'll just read out that sentence. So you say you received a call from Superintendent Coroner who told you that he had received a call from CBRN officers who said that it was unlikely the cause of the illness was radiation poisoning,
Yep.
as the symptoms would have taken far longer to manifest, and then in parenthesis, it's a slow onset,
Yep.
and that they could only have been taken ill that quickly if they had received a massive dose, and they would have suffered hair loss and reddening of the skin if that had been the case. And then you record, he told you it was therefore assessed as being far more likely that they had been poisoned, and this was significant as it distanced the circumstances from the death of Alexander Litvinenko.
Yeah.
And you were aware, and as was he, that Alexander Litvinenko had died from radiation poisoning.
Yes.
So that in your statement, you're describing this sort of reassurance that there wasn't radiation poisoning, which is something you had been worried about. But there's no discussion here about the cholinesterase inhibition, which is what VN005 had been worried about. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. You say in your statement on the next paragraph that the fact that the CBRN experts weren't describing this as a CBRN incident, that this reduced the likelihood that this was an assassination attempt in your mind.
At that moment in time.
But you hadn't received any reassurance that there wasn't cholinesterase inhibition. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
So, and help us with this. Was it just that in your mind you were concerned about radiation poisoning, and did you forget about VN005's concerns, or?
Most definitely not. Obviously, we were still within the same briefing, and when he'd expressed those concerns, that was what caused me to interrupt it the first time. Mm-hmm. So we've talked about the fact, or I've mentioned, that this is a very rare event. On anything similar is very rare. So the only comparator in my mind, from my own knowledge, as opposed to from any police databases, was Litvinenko. So I wanted to see whether there was any comparisons with that, as did Superintendent Coroner. So we'd explored that. He'd obviously called me back following the conversation. And in my mind at the time, had they had any concerns regarding chemical agents being used, they would have raised that during that telephone call, because they would have said, well, we can put your mind at ease regarding the radiation or the likelihood of radiation poisoning, but we need to talk to you about these things. But we didn't have that, and neither did we have any information from counter-terrorism policing to raise concerns.
I see. Well, you didn't have the conversations with the CBRN experts.
No.
That was Superintendent Coroner.
And I was grateful to him for that, because the time is playing out, and we talk about fast-track actions within policing. I wanted to get on and start doing some things, mm-hmm. And the fact that Superintendent Coroner had those conversations had taken a degree of pressure off me, but I know Superintendent Coroner, and I knew I could trust him, so I knew that he would have been relaying the facts.
Yes, but he didn't specifically reassure you that he had received advice about cholinesterase inhibition.
I haven't recalled it in my statement. I can't recall it now.
No.
I don't think so would be the answer.
Okay. I'm going to take you now to Superintendent Coroner's statement, and that's, it'll come up on the screen in front of you, reference 6163, page 9, paragraphs 39 and 40. So this is his statement recording what he was told. So he says, at approximately 10:35 that evening, I spoke to a female duty officer at the National CBRN Centre. I provided her with an overview of the incident and my online research, and he describes earlier in his statement that that's the research about Sergei Skripal. I further advised that the indications were the cause of the casualty's illness was not fentanyl poisoning, but based on my conversation with the CBRN tactical advisor, it was possibly radiation or nerve agent based. I was informed that she would speak to scientists who would then call me back. And then he says, from this point on, I received a large number of calls from the scientific community involving a number of different scientists. I explained the situation and information to date to each new caller, and the same message was reiterated. This message was that the symptoms did not sound like radiation poisoning. From my recollection, there was also no further mention of a chemical agent as being a likely cause at that time. So reading between the lines of Superintendent Corner's statement, he received a lot of calls from different scientists, and they reiterated that it wasn't radiation poisoning. And he says there was no mention of the chemical agent, but what he doesn't say is that he was reassured by a scientist that it wasn't cholinesterase inhibition. And I suppose you would agree, would you, that he didn't tell you that he had been so assured?
No, he didn't. And perhaps, with reflection, I should have pushed that point. But as I said, at that moment in time, at whatever time it was at night, it was near midnight, I felt that if there was concern about chemical agent poisoning, they would have been telling us, based on the symptoms that VN005 had described to us.
Okay, I'm going to move on now just to the repercussions of that conversation. So following that discussion, in fact, on the same phone call, Superintendent Corner had told you that he expressed a concern that there had been no search of the Skripal's home address. Is that right? Do you
That's
remember
correct,
that?
yes.
Okay. And can you recall what your discussions with him about the search were? And I'm on page 6 of your statement now.
Yes, certainly. Well, I shared that concern. I felt it was one of the key actions we needed to do that night was to complete the search. And I could understand why we hadn't rushed to do it earlier, because it was a developing event, but I felt we couldn't delay it for much longer. My main overriding concern was that there was another member of Mr. Skripal's family or an associate of his who was in the house who was injured and potentially dying.
Were you also concerned that a search should be performed to rule out other possible causes, for example, a suicide? So you might find a note or something.
Yeah, so obviously we would find a body or not find a body, if that makes sense. But there might be some other indications as to what had happened. Bearing in mind, I was still trying to sort of maintain an open mind. So yes, if there'd been a suicide note, that would have taken us down one route as a preferred hypothesis. But there may have been some indication of what they had taken or the nature of the poisoning. And within the parameters of searching the premises to see if anyone was anyone in there was medically ill, I felt we could do that at the same time. So as much as anything else, I was hoping that would help the medical staff with the treatment of the Skripals.
Yes. If we can go back to Superintendent Corner's statement, paragraphs 41 and 42. This is his account of the decision to make the search. So he says, throughout this period, I was concerned that the Skripal's house could have someone else located inside it who could have required medical attention, and I felt that we needed to safely conduct a cursory search of the property to confirm the situation. I also considered the possibility of a suicide pact and evidence in the form of a suicide note, together with any evidence of the cause of the casualty's incapacitation, such as drugs or poison. Any of these things could be of significant value to the investigation and be highly relevant to inform the treatment being provided to patients by the hospital. I had delayed instigating investigations at the address in the hope of greater clarity regarding the cause of their illness. However, as a result of consultations with the CBRN community and the lack of any further information from either the hospital or special branch, I felt I could delay no longer. And he confirms that at that stage he still didn't know the cause of the incapacitation, and that he was relieved when scientists had ruled out radiation poisoning and hadn't suggested a nerve agent. He was aware that hazardous materials were likely to be encountered, and he considered utilizing the fire brigade. But indications from the CBRN tactical advisor in that community were that a cursory search could be safely conducted as long as suitable protective equipment was used. And then he goes on to explain what the purpose of the search would be. And he concluded on the balance that CID officers were the most effective solution in the circumstances, and that this was a decision that he has now had cause to regret, and that the search was conducted under Section 17 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. Does that accord with your recollection of your discussions with Superintendent Corner?
Yes. I would say that it was my decision to search the house for the same reasons. Superintendent Corner also wanted that same thing. So we were both in agreement. He is technically the senior officer on duty in the county, so I can understand why he's recorded it in that way, which I hadn't seen until this morning. But equally, I was the SIO, so I would say I was accountable for the decision to search the house. But it was for the reasons that he's mentioned. And he talks about the fact that he's had cause to regret because of what happened to Detective Sergeant Bailey. I would say slightly differently. It's something that still haunts me because clearly Sergeant Bailey became very ill as a result of our actions that night.
Yes. I'm just going to pause you there, Mr. Mant. Sir, we are coming up to 11 o'clock.
Yes. Well, we're going to break or rather not break, but pause for 2 minutes, Mr. Manton. That's probably as convenient a time as any, but we'll let the clock get to 11 o'clock, I think, so that we can all see where we are. It's about 1 minute to, is it?
According to the transcript, it is 10:57:39.
Right. Is there any other short point that you want to deal with in a minute, Ms. Pottle? Don't cast around for one if it isn't convenient. Don't worry about it.
I don't think so, sir.
No,
I think
all
the
right.
next point will be longer.
Well, I think it's near enough. Shall we stand and keep silence for 2 minutes? Thank you. We remember all who've fallen in so many conflicts.
I'd just like to take you now to your statement at reference 5669, page 9, and the last paragraph, where you set out your rationale for conducting the search. You say that you were slightly nervous about what you might find at the house. You'd been thinking about the national decision-making model and were satisfied, based on your conversations and direction from Detective Superintendent Corner, that on the information we had available, it was still the right thing to do. The CBRN experts were satisfied that this was not a radiation incident. Special Branch had not raised any concerns or corroborated the online articles. The ICU consultant was satisfied that this had been an ingested poison, and it was important for us to enter the premises in order to be sure that there was nobody injured or dead within, and to identify obvious evidence that may have explained what had happened. You've told us that you feel that you were accountable for the decision to
Yes.
search, and that it's something that has haunted you because
Yes.
Sergeant Bailey fell ill. Would you agree that what's missing from this rationale in your statement is a confirmation from the experts that the poisoning that VN005 was worried about, the cholinesterase inhibition, that concern had not been allayed?
Yes.
I just want to ask you.
And would that have made a difference?
I've thought about that a lot since
Yes.
these events. Terribly, I suspect I would have still wanted to search the building that night.
Quite.
I think my objective of satisfying ourselves there was no one else in there who was injured would have overridden the other concerns. And that's why it haunts me, I guess, because, you know, what happened to Sergeant Bailey can't be reversed.
No. We saw reference in Superintendent Corner's statement to the use of the fire brigade to conduct the search because they would have more specialist equipment. Do you think that if you had remained of the opinion that a search needed to be conducted, I appreciate now we're talking about a hypothetical, but if you knew that this nerve agent poisoning was a possibility and you still remained to the view that the search needed to be conducted, might you have employed different resources, specialist resources, to conduct the search?
Yes, there was a reality to the situation, though. We know that Sergei and Julia were taken ill shortly after 4 o'clock. We knew that the car had been parked there shortly before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and this was now 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was conscious that the mobilisation of specialist resources, or I would have been aware that the mobilisation of specialist resources would have taken time. And my fear at that moment was that there was someone in the house who was potentially dying. So I'd have had to balance that. And I go back to the point earlier, whilst I'm not seeking to blame anyone else, I'm surprised with the benefit of hindsight that the national CBRN people hadn't spoken more about the chemical agent in their updates to Superintendent Corner, because I felt that if they had concerns, they would have expressed them. Mm-hmm. So I accept I didn't include that within my rationale.
You told us that you take responsibility for the decision. I just want to explore that with you a bit further, because you've described that Superintendent Corner, he would have been the silver command and you were the bronze. Deputy Chief Constable Mills, who was Gold, he was asked about this in his evidence on Thursday. And his evidence was, if I could be forgiven for saying, a little unclear on this point. But he said that the decision was ultimately for Superintendent Corner. And certainly in his witness statement, Superintendent Corner seems to regard it as his decision because he says it's a decision he's come to regret. What do you say to that?
I think the way I would view this would be that if there'd been a difference of opinion between Superintendent Corder and myself, the narrative would be very different. So I accept on what I've read there that Superintendent Corder might well have felt that he made the decision because he's articulated that. In my mind, whilst he was my senior officer, at that moment, I was responsible for the investigation, and this was an investigative inquiry that we were carrying out. Therefore, it was my decision to go in. Had I not wanted to go in, and had Superintendent Corner wanted me to go in, then that might have been a different set of circumstances. I think ultimately we would have carried out the search, but I would have recorded it. I didn't want to search the house, and Superintendent Corner has ordered me to, or words to that effect. I'm summarising clearly. But we didn't have that. We both agreed that it was a necessary action for the reasons we've already discussed. And yeah, so in my mind, it was my decision. I can understand why Superintendent Corner was a senior officer, the superintendent on that night, felt it was his decision.
Okay. Just before we leave this topic, I'm just going to take you to your police log where you record the decision. And that is reference 5553, page 3. We can pull that up on the screen. So this is the Major Investigation Policy book. It's longer than this, but this is the page that deals with this search. And just before I forget, sir, may this policy book be adduced into evidence, please?
Yes. Where am I looking, Ms. Bottle?
Yes. So, help us, Mr. Mant. Is this a contemporaneous record, or what is this document exactly?
So it's standard practice for officers making decisions to keep a policy log of those decisions. So this was recorded. I typed this out on the night, or in fact on the morning of the 5th. So and this is part of me setting out what we would sort of call a determination of the incident. So if you read it from page 1, you would see that I effectively set out what we, the police, are dealing with and where we'd got to at that point. So on page 3, I'm dealing with the inquiries that have already been carried out and completed by that time. And that's where we got to.
I think in your statement you describe at the end of the shift returning to Bourne Police Station and writing up the report.
Yeah,
is this document what you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. So if you see there, it's time date stamped at the bottom right box is 4:15 a.m.
Yes.
So that would have been the time I started typing it.
Mm-hmm. And you say the date of the decision, the 4th of May, the time, 3:30 in the morning. This is decision number 2.
And of course, that's not correct. It would have been the 5th of March that the decision was made.
Yes.
Not the 4th of May.
Yes. And the timing at 3:30, that would have been just before you entered the property.
So 3:30, I think that's when I sort of started to pull together that handover report. So the search was done slightly earlier than that.
Yes. Well, what I was going to ask you is that certainly your discussion with Superintendent Corner was much earlier in
Yes.
the evening, I believe just after midnight.
Yes.
Would you agree that the decision was actually taken during your discussions with Superintendent Corner?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, there was an urgency about getting on with things. So I was making notes as officers would do in that position, and this is when I typed it up.
Okay.
So I started sort of setting out what we were dealing with at 3:30 at Bourne Hill Police Station, and this particular part of it I got to at 4:15.
I see.
But what are we looking at this for now, Ms.
It just in
Except for completeness.
for completeness, yes. It sets out. It's the near contemporaneous record, if I can put it that way,
Yeah.
of the decision to
Well, it isn't
enter
a
the
record of the
property.
decision to search at all, is it?
Well, it's not phrased in that way.
No, there's a reference to the fact that the search was conducted at the bottom of the page, and that's the relevant bit, is it?
Yes, well, he describes his discussions with Superintendent Corner and his inquiries with Special Branch, no direct intelligence having been shared.
Yes.
They discuss the safety risk, the risk that exists, and then it records that Superintendent Corner directed that there were no substantive steps that had to be taken above and beyond wearing protective clothing and using common sense.
Yes, I see.
So that was in relation to, obviously we'd had the concerns raised by VN005 about the risk of chemical agent. That had been relayed to the national CBRN experts. So if there was any suggestion we should conduct this search differently beyond what was directed there, then I would have expected to receive that. But that goes back to the point we've made that, or I've made, that we weren't giving any more information regarding that element.
Yes.
So I would say that the protective equipment we were wearing that night is consistent with the protective equipment I'd have expected to have worn if I was entering what I believe to be a murder scene, because you obviously want to prevent yourself as much as anything else from contaminating the scene with, you know, your fingerprints, your DNA, those kind of things. But there's obviously an added benefit that it gives you protection, hence personal protection equipment.
Yes, and just before we turn away from this document, it says Detective Superintendent Corner directed, and I just want to check with you. That word rather suggests that he's sort of in charge.
Yeah, so that was about the mechanism of the search.
I see.
So at some point, and I can recall this, I'd said to Superintendent Corner, you know, how should we conduct the search? And he'd come back to reassure me, normal protective personal equipment will be appropriate in these circumstances.
Okay.
And I felt that National CBRM would have told him had that not been the case.
I see. Thank you very much. We can take that down now. We're coming up to 11:15, so I have a few more matters to take with this witness. I think it would be an appropriate time for a break. I'm told that we need to pause for 20 minutes because there's a technical issue that needs resolving.
Well, far be it from me to disagree, whatever it is. I'm sure we shall have to make do with that. 25-2. Now, Mr. Mann, you're in the middle of your evidence, of course, remember the rules. Back at 25-2, please.
All rise.
Yes, Mr. Bottle.
Before we move on to the search of Christy Miller Road, I'd like to keep things in a chronological order. So I'd like to ask you first about your visit to Salisbury District Hospital.
Yes.
Because it's right, isn't it? You spoke with Superintendent Corner, discussed the search, but in fact, after that, you didn't go straight to the house. You instead went to the hospital to speak with a consultant.
That's correct.
Okay. You attended Salisbury District Hospital with Nick Bailey, and I'm looking here at page 8 of your statement.
Yes.
You arrived at about 1 a.m.
Yes,
and you spoke with Sister Nicol. Do you recall that?
I do.
And Dr. Cockcroft, who was treating the Skripals at that point, he wasn't on the ward. Is that correct?
No.
He had gone home, but Sister Nicol informed you that you could speak to him on the phone and that he would expect your call. Is that right?
That's correct. I think I later discovered he was in another part of the hospital
I see.
dealing with a matter, but he wasn't in the ward, but he was happy to take the phone call.
And you took the phone into an office so you could speak with him privately on the
Yes.
phone? Okay. And do you recall now what conversation you had with him?
Yes, it was in relation to the open source searching that had been carried out regarding Sergei. And it was a concern, again, shared by Superintendent Corder and myself, that the medical staff should be aware of the suggestion from open source searching that he was a spy, because naturally that created a difference to the normal poisonings that they would have seen in or around Salisbury. And we felt it was important to share that information. And at that point, I don't think it had been
Shared with the hospital?
shared with the hospital.
I see. And what did Dr. Cockcroft say to you about that?
It was actually quite reassuring, because he had also Googled the Skripals, and he'd seen the same information. And as I've already said, we hadn't been given any extra information from counter-terrorism policing. So we didn't hold any information in Wiltshire. So he effectively had the same information as we did. We remarked about how surprising and unusual a set of circumstances it was.
And did you discuss with him the cause of the illness?
Yes. He was actually very reassuring to me. At that point, he was of the opinion that it was an ingested poisoning, and by that, one which he indicated had been taken orally. That was my understanding of it, which potentially took us back to poisoning using food or something else, as opposed to what later transpired had happened.
And did he give you any indication of what kind of poison it was? Did he mention any chemicals, do you remember, or no?
So what I do remember was that Mr. Cockcroft had previously worked in another hospital where he'd had some experience of dealing with ricin poisoning, and he was quite satisfied that it wasn't connected to ricin. He also agreed that it was unlikely to be radiation poisoning. So I'd explained that we'd had some advice from the national CBRN experts, and he agreed with that based on his medical experience and knowledge. And he was of the view that there was an ingested poisoning. I discussed with him whether or not we, as in the police, could help with toxicology. He had limited toxicology available to him on site at the hospital at that particular moment, whereas the police are able to expedite toxicology tests in some circumstances. So that led to us having the conversation around taking some further samples from both Sergei and Julia Skripal.
So he told you that they could do tests, and had done, for alcohol, paracetamol, and acetylsalicylic acid, which is aspirin.
Yep.
Is that right?
That's correct.
and that they had taken urine for a toxicology test, but that wasn't a quick process.
Yes.
And you had indicated that you would take a pre-transfusion blood sample anyway, as part of your evidential process.
So obviously, ordinarily, that's what you would look to do if you were investigating a homicide or a serious assault and the victims were unconscious. There are always issues with consent, because obviously the police can't just take blood from people. But if the victim is unconscious, then their doctor can effectively give you that consent. And he was very happy to do so. And he encouraged me to facilitate what we call fast-track toxicology.
And were you able to put that in place?
Well, we started to. I mean, obviously, things changed as the 5th went on.
Right.
But at that point, that's what the plan would have been. So I would have been impressing on those officers that took over from me the importance and urgency of examining the blood and urine from both of the Scripples.
And after your discussions with Dr. Cockcroft, Sister Nicol went to get the samples, didn't she?
Yes.
And Nick Bailey was tasked with taking custody of the samples, is that right?
Yes, so clearly it's important that you have continuity in the exhibits, and we agreed that Nick would take responsibility for taking possession of those exhibits and then securing them and storing them correctly at Bourne Hill Police Station.
And afterward, you updated Superintendent Corner on your conversations with Dr. Cockcroft, is that right?
That's correct, and obviously within my statement, I recorded the text message I sent to him. It was starting to get very late in the night or early in the morning, depending on your perspective. So I'd said to Tim after our Superintendent Corner, after our last conversation, that I would text him with the update. And I was conscious that he was still awake because he replied instantly. So I think the timings will show that I sent it at 1:33 a.m. and he replied at 1:34, having read it.
Yes, okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on now to the search itself. So this is dealt with on pages 9 and 10 of your statement. You returned from Salisbury District Hospital back to the police station, Bourne Hill Police Station, and you collected VN 005.
That's correct.
Right? And then you traveled together with Nick Bailey, and you arrived at the address at 2:30 in the morning.
Yes.
Is that right? Outside the house was PC Oliver Bell. I think he was the scene guard. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And he had the keys to the address. Is that right?
From memory, yes, that's correct. I think another officer had secured them from the neighbour earlier in the evening.
Yes. Now I'm reading at the penultimate paragraph of page 9 of your statement, and I'm going to ask you about the preparations you made before you entered the house.
Yes.
You changed into personal protective equipment, is that right?
That's correct.
Do you remember what that equipment was?
Yes, so we applied a forensic suit, a white suit. We then had boot covers that went over our shoes, so you don't take your shoes off, you put them over your shoes. We had gloves, and we had goggles, and we had sort of a surgical mask.
Do you recall asking to borrow PC Bell's body-worn camera?
Yes, so clearly in an investigation such as this, I was always going to have to hand it over at some point because I wasn't going to be physically capable of running it during the day. So ordinarily you'd make notes as you did the search so that other officers would be aware of what the circumstances of your search and what you'd found. When I got there, I saw that PC Bell was wearing body-worn video, and this was still relatively new within the context of Wiltshire policing. And it just struck me, this is a brilliant example, there's been a brilliant opportunity rather, of being able to accurately record everything within the search. Because had we subsequently discovered that something had happened inside the Scripples address, it could become quite relevant. You know, was that door open or closed? Was that light on or off? Was this window open or closed? And body worn gives you sort of an irrefutable record of that search.
And did you take hold of the body-worn camera? Do you remember? Did you carry it with you in the search?
Yeah,
or-
so I didn't. I think I did take it off PC Bell, but I would have then handed it to VN005. And the reason for that is that I hadn't been trained on body-worn video, whereas I knew that VN005 had, due to his normal duties.
Yes.
And therefore, because I wanted it done properly, you know, I didn't want to find out that I hadn't pressed record or something.
Yes. And you borrowed PC Bell's torch as well. Do you recall that?
Yes. As it transpired, there was no issues with the electrics in the house, but I didn't want to go in there and find suddenly that we couldn't turn the lights on or off or something like that.
And did you hold the torch during the search, or was it Nick Bailey and VN005? Do you remember?
I think we probably all touched it at some point. I honestly can't remember. I think there might have been occasions where we can just put the torch on this or not. But I've not been able to view the body-worn video, so I can't comment exactly.
Okay, I'm now going to ask you about entering the property. Nick Bailey unlocked the property using a key that he had possession of. Do you remember that?
Yes, he did. So the circumstances of that are that from a crime investigation perspective, it's very significant as to whether that door was secure or insecure, whether it's locked or unlocked. So I knew we had the key, so we wouldn't have to force entry, but I wanted to see whether or not the door was locked. It wasn't the kind of door where if you push it to it locks. You have to physically lock it. So Sergeant Bailey took hold of the handle and sort of gave it a yank a couple of times, which satisfied us all that it was locked. He then unlocked the using the key, and then obviously that enabled him to open the door.
Yeah. You say we. He was the one touching
Yes.
the door, is that right?
Yes, he did. I asked him to check the door was locked, which he did, and then he unlocked it, and then he opened it.
Okay. And did you touch the door handle at any stage?
I'm pretty sure I did, but I think only in passing. So Nick obviously took grip of the handle to check that it was locked. I think I would have momentarily touched it.
I see.
But this is something that's 6.5 years ago and that I've relived 1,000 times probably.
I see. And just to clarify, forgive me, I'm not sure if you mentioned it a moment ago when you discussed the personal protective gear, but you were also wearing gloves. Is
Yes.
that right? Yes. And Nick Bailey was wearing gloves as well.
Yes, we were all wearing gloves. We were all wore the same sort of uniform of protective equipment.
Mm-hmm. Now, asking you, now that you've entered the home address, Nick Bailey records in his statement that he switched a light on in the hallway after he touched the door handle. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I think I did, because I think I might have actually asked him, can you check if the power's on? Because to a certain degree, that was going to help the search enormously.
I see. And when you entered into the property, you conducted a cursory search, is that right?
Yeah, so the objective of the search was to see whether there's anyone in there who was injured, or to see whether or not there's anything obvious regarding suicide or what may have been ingested. So it was never going to be a fingertip search. So we went around the house relatively quickly. Had we been doing a forensic search, we'd have probably been there for days, if that makes sense.
I see. And you didn't find any people, you didn't find any suicide notes or any obvious cause for the poisoning, is that right?
Absolutely, yeah,
Okay.
thankfully.
Now I'm just going to ask you about items that were touched in the property. We know obviously that there was Novichok on the front door handle and that this would have transferred to Nick Bailey's gloves. And I want to explore with you the items that Nick Bailey touched in the property once he was inside. You might not recall or have seen, but I'm just going to ask you a bit about that. So we discussed the light switch already. Nick Bailey states that he thinks he touched paperwork downstairs. Do you recall seeing that?
Yeah, so if you remember that one of the objectives was around a suicide note, so we did look at some documentation that was lying around. I wish I could give you more detail about what he did or didn't touch, but I simply cannot recall that.
Okay. He says that he thinks he might have touched a bathroom cabinet upstairs looking for medication. Did you see that or no?
We certainly looked for medication because obviously one of the hypotheses could have been some form of suicide or overdose. So we were looking for that. It makes sense that we'd have looked in the bathroom cabinet. I cannot recall it precisely.
Okay. And he thinks he might have touched a cupboard in Yulia's bedroom. Do you remember that or no?
I remember us having a look through. I remember the wardrobe being opened, and you know, from an investigative perspective, there was very few items of clothing in there. So, you know, from my perspective, not knowing the background, that made me think that she didn't live there. Mm-hmm. It was also very unusual because she had, which I do remember bizarrely, there was a television above the headboard of the bed. But of course, you can't watch television if it's above your headboard. So there was a pillow at the end of the bed. So you'd have to sort of sit the wrong way, or lie the wrong way down the bed. And I remember thinking that was unusual. Mm-hmm. But sadly, I can't remember what Nick did or didn't touch.
I see. And focusing on you for a moment, do you remember what you might have touched in the property?
Well, I would have been doing the same primarily as Nick. We were. I would have picked up things, but been probably bits of paper just to look at them. I remember there was a calendar on the landing. I remember just sort of having a quick look at any dates on there, or anything relevant on the calendar. But you know, the objective was, were there any people in the house? No. Secondly, was there anything to indicate what they'd taken? So it really wasn't a detailed search from that perspective.
No, I see. Can I just ask you about two items? In your statement, you say that you recall touching the back door.
Oh yeah.
Is that right? I
checked the back door to see whether or not that was insecure, and it was. So I instinctively locked it. You know, arguably, perhaps I should have left it insecure, given there was a police guard on the premises, but I just locked it. But that was significant from the investigation perspective, because obviously that showed that someone could have entered the premises in between the Scribbles leaving and the police arriving after their poisoning.
In your statement, you also say that you think you might have touched Yulia's dressing table. There were blister tablets on the top of the dressing table in her room. Do you remember that?
Yeah, absolutely, and purely to see what they were, whether or not that might have been part of their illness, or her illness.
You prepared another statement on the 6th of April of 2018, and that is reference 5279. We can pull that up, please. By the time this statement is drafted, you're aware that Novichok was found on the front door handle. So during the larger statement that we've been referring to so far, which is dated the 12th of March, at that point you didn't know what the source of the contaminant was.
The investigation team might have been, but I wasn't, and there was no reason for me to.
But by the time you came to draft the second statement, the 6th of April, you did know. And in this statement, you explain how it is that the three of you came to touch your goggles once you were inside the address.
Yes.
That's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
And I'll just read that. I would highlight on the night of the 4th of March, the outside ambient temperature was low. This meant that the protective goggles that D.S. Bailey, VN005, and myself wore steamed up. And as a result of the inside of the house being much warmer. Therefore, from memory, all three of us at different times raised and lowered our goggles in order to help us see. We did this wearing gloves, but it clearly raises the potential for any contaminant on the outside of the gloves to have been transferred to the skin of our faces and foreheads during the physical process of raising and lowering the goggles. The body-worn camera video of the search is likely to have captured that. I think that is readily understandable to those of us who wear glasses, who might experience the same thing. Do you recall seeing Nick Bailey putting his hands to his goggles and raising them?
Yes, I do, because I'm confident that the three of us did. And what we're talking about, and I realise it won't help for the transcript, but I was literally going sort of like this with goggles, not glasses,
Yes.
because of the way they were steaming up. And the other thing we did, not knowing exactly what was happening and the surroundings we were in, is I know that I wiped my forehead with my hand, which was in a glove, and I'm confident I did that with the back of my hand, whereas my suspicion, my recollection, to the best I can remember, is that Nick's was the other way around. So I think he wiped his forehead, but with the palm of his hand rather than the back of his hand.
Yes. I'm going to ask you now about taking off your PPE. After the search was complete, you exited the address and you took off, all three of you took off your PPE.
Yeah.
This was supervised by VN 005, is that right?
Absolutely. So VN, obviously, Superintendent Corner earlier had given us advice around the PPE that we needed to wear based on the interactions with the National CBRN team. VN 005 had commented on that as well. So he was satisfied with the PPE, and he was volunteered really to take the lead on taking them off and then storing them. And I was grateful to him for his professional advice on that. So we did store them. We took them all off. We put them all into exhibit bags.
I'd like to ask you specifically about the body-worn camera,
Yes.
because that belonged to PC Bell.
Yes.
And we know that he subsequently had some symptoms
Yes.
of cholinesterase inhibition in his eye. So just exploring how that might have happened. So we know that VN 005 had the camera
Correct.
because he had been trained in it. Do you remember how that was returned to him?
Yeah. From memory, I think he gave me the camera and I gave it back to PC Bell, just because of the way we were stood at the time, as opposed to any deliberate act. But clearly, if there was Novichok on our gloves, there was an opportunity for that to have been placed onto the outside of the body-worn camera.
I see.
And PC Bell had sort of the police issue tactical vests where you have effectively a holder for the camera, and he sort of clipped it back on. And I'm very confident that he wasn't wearing gloves, and I wouldn't have expected him to.
So you and VN 005 were wearing gloves,
Yes,
and he wasn't.
yes.
I see.
For the best of my recollection.
Yes.
Again, the body-worn video would have probably clarified that.
Can I ask, the torch as well that had been borrowed and used during the search?
Yes.
You told us a moment ago that you think you might all have actually touched the torch. Yeah. Do you recall how that was given back to PC Bell?
Well, I think it was the same way. I can't I'd have to just refresh my mind from the statement whether or not I handed it back to him or not.
So we're on page 12 now of your statement, paragraph 5.
Yeah, when it is. Well, my memory. I know it's given back to PC Bell.
If you can't remember,
I can't
you
be
must say
sure.
so. Okay. Okay, and now quickly, I'm going to deal with PC Bell's eye.
Yes.
You returned back to Bourne Hill Police Station after the
Yes.
search to write up your report, and that report is the log that we've seen already. PC Bell's eye was brought to your attention by Tracy Holloway, is
Yes.
that right? She asked you to have a look at his eye.
Yes.
Can you tell us what you saw when you looked at PC Bell?
It was very startling. He had one pupil that was literally the size of a pinprick. It was so small, and his other pupil was very dilated. Now, I've seen people with pinprick pupils, and I've seen people with dilated pupils, but I've never seen somebody with both at the same time.
I see.
So obviously, I said, well, we need, trying not to alarm PC Bell, I said, we need to get you checked out, so let's get you to the hospital. And you need to tell the A&E staff, you need to make sure they're aware that you've been to the same house as the Scripples, who of course were effectively, not literally upstairs in intensive care, but were very nearby in intensive care.
And how did PC Bell seem, aside from his eye, when you saw him? Was he otherwise well, or was he not feeling
Well, I think
well?
obviously, I think he'd started to feel a bit unwell. He'd obviously spoken to his colleague who was on the cordon with him. I think they'd seen the eyes and gone, that doesn't look right. So I think he was nervous. He wasn't hysterical or displaying any sort of huge other symptoms. Mm-hmm. But that was the moment, of course, where it occurred to me that whatever it was we were dealing with was likely to have been at Christie Miller Road. Because until that time, we didn't know that had happened. And I think in my mind, based on the ingested poisoning hypothesis, that it could well have happened within Salisbury city centre as opposed to at the home address.
Okay, and a final question. In your statement prepared in March, the long one, on page 14 you say, "I cannot explain why Nick has developed symptoms, whereas I don't appear to have done so."
That's correct.
Do you know now?
Well, I can't know for sure. My recollection of how we might have wiped our foreheads may explain that. But that wasn't anything intentional. So because we didn't know what we were dealing with, if that is what happened, I never consciously used the back of my hand as opposed to the front, and Nick wouldn't have consciously used the front of his hand as opposed to his back. It was just a very hot environment. You know, Mr. Scribble had the central heating turned right up, and with the stuff that we had on top in terms of our clothing and the personal protective equipment, it was just really hot in there. Mm. But no, it's one of those things which I wish I could explain.
Yes. Well, from what you've told us, we know the Novichok was on the front door handle and it would have been on his glove. You
Yes.
described him touching his forehead. You didn't touch your forehead with the front of your gloves. And I think what you're saying to us is that that's nothing intentional. It was luck. Would you agree with that?
It literally was. And that's what, when I said earlier that it haunts me, that's why it haunts me.
Well, Mr. Mann, it's unavoidable that you do so, but don't guess at what the mechanics,
Yes.
the scientific mechanics might be. What you can do is tell us what you remember that you did or
Yes.
didn't.
Yeah.
Yes, well, with that warning, and that is, in fact, the end of the questions that I have for you. But I believe there will be some questions.
Then thank you very much, Ms. Pottle. Just wait a moment, Mr. Mann. No questions. Nothing? No? Anybody else? No? Then in that case, Mr. Mann, we can let you go. Thank you very much. There's no need to stay, but of course you're entitled to watch if you feel you want to.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your help.
So we're just having a change around, but
No,
we
no,
have...
you get yourself sorted so
and
that you're organised.
thank you, another witness. Now attending, Professor Dame Sally Davis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just stay on your feet for a minute, Sally, would you?
We're just getting a copy of her statement as well, just for a moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down. Use the microphones in front. What I need is your recollection of what you can tell me. Opinions within your expertise only. By all means, use the statement that you've been provided with, which you made fairly recently, as far as I can see. If you need to help, but you're not bound by it, you must tell me what the answers to the questions are. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Professor, as you know, my name's Francesca Whitelaw and I ask questions on behalf of the inquiry. Could you give us your full name, please?
Sally Claire Davis. And I wonder if I could use this moment to express my condolences to the family of Dawn Sturgess for this terrible and sad event.
Thank you very much. Thank you for attending today to give evidence. As indicated, you should have a copy in front of you of your witness statement you made for the inquiry, which is 14 pages in length. If we could have the first page on screen, the reference is INQ 006138. We see in the top right-hand corner that it's dated the 3rd of October 24, but we'll also see in a moment that you signed it on the 18th of October, so only a few weeks ago. At paragraph 2, the last sentence reads, "This statement is true to the best of my knowledge and belief." And if we could go to page 13 of the statement, please. There is a final statement of truth there. If you could just read that to yourself. And then if we could go to page 14. Did you sign your statement where a redaction has been made?
I did.
Signature? Thank you. And can you confirm now the contents of the statement remain true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They do.
So with your permission, the whole statement will be adduced. And
Yes,
published.
please, but I'd like you to explore with the witness what material she had access to when she was asked to make a statement a month ago.
Yes, indeed. Would you like me to start with that, sir? Or I
Take
can-
your own course, but I need to know that.
Well, perhaps if we could just deal with your background and qualifications first, and then
Yes.
I will certainly move to the documents. So firstly, your qualifications, which are set out at page 2 and paragraph 5 of your statement. Do you hold a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery degree from the University of Manchester?
I do.
So that's a basic medical qualification.
It is.
Yeah.
And also an MSc in Immunology from the University of London?
Correct.
Are you a Fellow of the Faculty of Public Health, the Royal Society, and the Academy of Medical Sciences?
I was of the Faculty of Public Health, but probably no longer now I'm retired. The other two I continue.
Thank you. And are you an international member of the National Academy of Medicine in the USA?
Yes.
And secondly, your roles. What is your current role?
I am the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge.
And are you also the UK Special Envoy on Antimicrobial Resistance in an honorary capacity?
Yes. Sorry, I didn't think to mention that. Absolutely unpaid, but supported by the government.
And also a member of the UN's Global Leaders Group on Antimicrobial Resistance?
Yes.
And what were your roles in March and June 2018?
I was Chief Medical Officer.
Was that between June 2010 and October 2019?
It was, and the first year I was in the post as an interim, and then there was a competition and I was appointed.
And you're going to tell us, I'm quite sure, what that involves, but let council ask the questions.
Thank you, sir. I certainly will come to that in a moment. Between 2004 and 2016, had you also been the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department of Health and Social Care?
Yes, I was, and so that role as CSA overlapped for a few years with being the Chief Medical Officer. I was, at the same time as being CSA, I was the Director General for Research for the Department of Health, and while as a Chief Medical Officer I was a permanent secretary, I continued to be responsible for R&D in the Department of Health and the NHS in England until 2016.
Until 2016?
Yes.
Yeah.
What roles did you hold outside of government?
I was on the World Health Organization Executive Board, and I...
Was that from 2014 to 2016, as you say in your statement?
Yes.
And were you also a co-convener of the United
Nations Interagency Coordination Group on Antimicrobial Resistance? Yes, I was.
from 2017 to 2020?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Actually, I thought it was till 2019, but as I should explain, I have some form of dyslexia, so my memory of dates and things is never brilliant. I failed the 11 plus, and so I had to learn to compensate.
Perhaps that would be a good opportunity just to address the point that the Chair made previously about documents. You say within your statement that you don't have access any longer to papers from when you were CMO. Is that correct? So could you tell us what documents you have reviewed in making your witness statement? Broadly speaking, obviously not specifically remembering each document.
I saw a wodge that was about that thick, mainly minutes of meetings, public commentaries from myself, the Home Office Secretary of State. I had not seen most of those at the time in 2018, so my statement relies on that list, which I know you hold, and those memories I have.
Right.
Thank you. And as we go through the documents, I'll confirm with you, but do indicate if there's anything you haven't had an opportunity to look at before. Moving then to the role of the Chief Medical Officer, could you tell us briefly what that role involves?
So I was appointed to be the Chief Medical Officer for England. There are Chief Medical Officers for the other devolved administrations, but that meant I was the most senior medical advisor to the UK government. Historically, the post seemed to alternate between a public health specialist and another specialist of doctor. So my predecessor and successors were public health specialists. My background had been haematology, specifically or particularly sickle cell disease, and of course research and research strategy and science. But my role was included being the professional head within government of public health and supporting and advising on all things medical and public health to the government. The government had early on changed the structure, so where my predecessor had worked quite extensively in the NHS, while I reserved the right to comment or to work on it, in practice I was a medical director and I rarely intervened. So that left me with public health, government policy on health, global health and issues like the science in general.
And to what extent is the position independent?
Totally. And no one would doubt that I always act as I think is morally right and correct with the evidence. And it can be uncomfortable for ministers.
So an independent advisor to government, but supported by an office in the Department of Health and Social Care, is that right?
Yes, I had 13 in my office, including 2 deputy chief medical officers. One is particularly relevant to this inquiry in that he represented me at a number of meetings.
Was that Professor Jonathan Van Tam?
It was. I appointed him and he assisted me.
And is the CMO based in the Department of Health and Social Care?
Yes, that's where I sat, but I made a point of the fact I was Chief Medical Officer for the whole of government, whereas my predecessor focused much more on the NHS.
What, in practical terms, but in overview at this stage, did the role involve in terms of the 2018 poisonings?
So, not described it this way, I was probably the focal point where the health issues came together in advising ministers and government. But clearly, I was advised by not only my own small team, but the emergency preparedness experts within the department, within the Cabinet Office, but particularly from Public Health England, where the government's expertise on emergencies that impacted on health was and is.
And what was your involvement in SAGE? And if you could say briefly what that was.
The Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. So I would be invited to join SAGE, which is convened by the government's chief scientific advisor, again, an independent post at permanent secretary level. If the Government Office for Science thought it was relevant, as would the chief scientific advisor from the Department of Health. If it was a specifically health issue, then I would co-chair that session or part of the session with the government's chief scientific advisor.
So SAGE is convened, as it were, ad hoc, is it?
It's convened when a COBRA
Yes.
is, thank you, called in order to provide the COBRA meetings with scientific advice.
Yes, but what I mean is, by the sound of it, but correct me if I'm wrong, it's not so much a standing body as
Correct.
an event-specific one.
Correct.
Got it.
And before we address the specifics, could you just explain then the role of the chief scientific advisor, the government chief scientific advisor?
Again, appointed as an independent advisor at permanent secretary level with a big office of about 100 people called the Government Office of Science to advise on science and technology, the whole of government.
Is that what's known as Go Science?
Yes, Government Office for Science, Go Science.
And who was the GCSA in 2018?
So in the first part of this event, there was an acting GCSA, Professor Chris Whitty, now the Chief Medical Officer, who was appointed by me and the Department of Health and Civil Service in 2016 to take on that role I had had of Director General of Research and Chief Scientific Advisor. By the time we get to July, but I don't know the exact date, the new permanent or long-term Chief Scientific Advisor was appointed, Patrick Valance.
And is the role of the GCSA to advise the Prime Minister and Cabinet rather than all government departments?
Yes, probably.
As you say in your witness statement, that most government departments also had departmental chief scientific advisors.
Yes, and they were not managerially responsible to the GCSA, but there was a dotted line for about evidence and science, but not managerial responsibility.
And was Professor Sir John Aston the Home Office chief scientific advisor in 2018?
Yes.
Was he someone with whom you worked during the Salisbury and Amesbury incident responses?
He was on the SAGE meeting that I went to and was active during this, yes.
So did you work with him, liaise with him outside of SAGE or just within that
I have
structure?
no memory of liaising with him directly outside. We met at the SAGE. I think we met at a couple of other meetings in the Home Office, but I don't remember any other interactions. That's not to say if he comes next week and says there were some, that they didn't happen. It's just I don't recall them.
Thank you. And how would you describe your relationship as CMO with the GCSA, Professor Whitty, at the time of the Salisbury and Amesbury events?
We had worked together for some years. We knew each other as senior medics. I think he's very good. We have a good personal relationship as well as a good working relationship, which continues to this day.
In the event of disagreement regarding public health matters, who had the final say?
Well, I would assume I did, but I suppose others might dispute it, but I don't know why. The ministers would look to me.
And what was the role of Public Health England, which we know has since become the UK Health Security Agency, but we're speaking about 2018?
So they led all the work on public health on behalf of the government that was not policy focused. So they were the advisory arm in that they had employed many scientists in the sites up and down the country that they used. They delivered programs and they held the expertise in medical emergencies from infective to CBRN, nuclear and everything else. And they were there to lead the response and to advise on the policy issues and to advise me as CMO and ministers with me and through me.
And was PHE's programme of work set by the Department of Health and Social Care?
The main programme of work was set by a letter each year, but they were expected to continue to maintain their expertise in safety and security and deliver their standard programme.
And in general terms, what were your interactions as CMO with PHE?
So I met the chief executive on a regular but not frequent time period. Not frequent because, of course, he was an NHS manager who was appointed to that position, so he did not specifically advise me, but I met regularly, at least once a month, with the chief medical officer, Paul Cosford, who sadly has since then died.
Chief Medical Officer for what? Public Health England?
Chief, yes, their
Thank you.
chief. He was probably called their medical director, actually. I met with their medical director, Paul Cosford, at least monthly, talking about the work they were doing. But at many of my meetings, he or others would be there. So I knew most of the senior people I would expect.
And was the PHE chief executive at that time Duncan Selby?
Yes.
If we could then begin to look at the public health advice following the Salisbury incident. I'm going to take it chronologically. So starting with Monday the 5th of March, how and when did you become aware of the Skripal poisoning, which had occurred on the Sunday the 4th of March?
I was told during that day of the incident.
Sorry, during which day?
Monday, the 5th of March. I apologise. I don't remember at what time. And, of course, information to the Chief Medical Officer's office comes from many places. I don't remember who made sure I knew, but it would be routine that I was told.
So I'm looking at paragraph 13 of your statement
Yep.
on page 3. When you wrote your statement, you thought it was on the morning of the Monday, the 5th of March. Do you remember now?
Well, I think it was late morning, but if someone told me I was wrong, I wouldn't be able to disagree.
Well, that's what I want to know. When you're guessing, tell me.
Yeah, I will. But I think it was.
Yes, thank you.
The inquiry has heard evidence that at local level, Deputy Chief Constable Paul Mills chaired a strategic coordination group which had within it a scientific and technical advisory committee which followed national guidance from PHE and others and disseminated it locally. Are you aware of, familiar with the local structures for public health advice?
Not fully. I only worked on the national bit. I do remember during that week that unfolded from March the 5th, the concerns that there was both local scientific advice and national scientific advice, and there really should only be one version of the evidence and the advice, a correct version.
So what then were the national structures for responding to an incident like this?
Let me start by saying I relied on our very expert civil servants in emergency preparedness to not only know the structures, but to set them in place and make it work. And it always felt very busy when there was an emergency, and they'd take me from one meeting to another, briefing me on the way. So what they did set up, and I do remember being told, was this strategic response group. What we had worked hard at over the preceding years was how to make sure that when you have a Department of Health that leads on policy and some communications, the NHS, national and local, and Public Health England, how you made sure that they were all in tune, knowing what's going on, taking the same view and communicating effectively. And so there was an emergency preparedness suite in the Department of Health, and there would be people from each of the three organisations in there working side by side in order to try and make sure that everything was actually in tune and working effectively on behalf of the nation to sort the problem out.
So some co-location between those bodies within the Department of Health, was that specifically in response to the March incident, or were they co-located before then?
There was a suite of offices for that co-location where they will have started. They did start in the March. If it grew very big, sometimes they moved to other places. But there was a plan that had the co-location in order to get as smooth and effective a response as possible.
What you've described as the emergency preparedness suite, that is, and that predates any particular emergency, does it?
Yes, well,
I see.
it goes back before me.
Right.
In your statement, you refer to regular cross-system health conference calls being initiated as was routine protocol between key points of contact within DHSC, PHE and NHS England. Is that what you've described then as the part of the forum of the strategic response group? Or is that something different?
I never went to the strategic response group. All I was concerned with was, were they all communicating effectively, meeting, whether digitally or in person, effectively? And I was reassured then, before and after, that they were having the appropriate calls. So sometimes you'd have moderately senior civil servants co-located, and then more senior ones having phone calls. But I was not party to those.
So how did you get information from those forums?
They would, normally one of the more senior emergency preparedness civil servants would come and brief me, or brief my office, who would then brief me.
So the emergency preparedness part of DHSC, we've seen reference in your statement to the PHE's strategic response group. Who do you think was effectively running the SRG? Was that PHE or DHSC, or was it a combination?
I would assume that the Department of Health were the more senior, but that PHE would play a significant role in the running of it, because they have the responsibility of not only the evidence but the on-the-ground people, so that the NHS was important for what was happening in the hospital, but it was Public Health England that had a local director and the links in the local area, as well as the scientific expertise.
In terms of how things worked at national level, who had ultimate responsibility for giving the public health and safety advice following the poisonings?
If you're talking about to ministers and the Prime Minister, then it's me. It was the Chief Medical Officer.
Advice to ministers, yes.
Yes. If you're talking about public communication, then there was always a discussion, or there is always a discussion about who is most appropriate for what message. So if it was local, it would be the local director of public health. If it was national, then on occasion, it was me.
If we could go to a document now, please, INQ 005797, page 1. Do you recognise that as a letter written by you to Sir Jeremy Hayward, the Cabinet Secretary?
Yes.
And dated the 16th of March?
Yes.
And you say in the first line, I want to update you personally on the health elements and next steps.
Yes.
And then we see in the second paragraph, following notification of the incident on
The morning.
It's
There we
answered
are.
that question for us, thank you.
Yes.
Morning of the 5th of March, regular cross-system health conference calls were initiated with key points of contact within the Department of Health and Social Care, Public Health England and NHS England identify. This forum was used to access the immediate risk to public health and to determine and coordinate any mitigating action required. So is that the description of the SRG?
I think so, yes.
And if we could just go to page 4 of this document, which has a timeline on it. We see there, 4th of March, Sunday, incident, 5th of March, late, I think that refers to the time, GCSA asked for a briefing, including commissioning work on generic effects of organophosphates, and then 6th, nerve agent established. So we're going to come back to that document, but just while we're looking at the early period of the 5th of March, I just wanted to draw attention to that, so we can take it down for the moment. So then, moving to the Tuesday, the 6th of March, and returning to your witness statement, at paragraph 15 on page 4, you say, although I was not present on the 6th of March 2018, I understand that PHE's strategic response group met and noted the public health risk was low. So we're going to look at a document for that, INQ 004702. Now, I think this is then the meeting that you said you weren't present for. Do you recognise these as SRG minutes? Have you seen SRG minutes before?
I had not seen these until I was asked to look at them in preparation for this inquiry and my statement.
Would you at the time have ever seen SRG minutes?
Not generally. I would be briefed on the issues that I needed to be aware of. So I don't think I did generally.
So I think we can see here, this gives us an idea, first of all, of the attendees. So we've got Jenny Harries, Strategic Incident Director, PHE. Did you work with Jenny Harries during the response to the 2018 poisonings at all?
Yes, but I don't recall on what specifically, but she was leading for PHE. I was generally briefed and advised by Dr. Nick Gent, who...
I think we see just at the bottom there, apologies for that meeting.
Yeah.
But we also see above that Jonathan Van Tam, who was your Deputy Chief Medical Officer. So would his responsibilities have included representing the CMO's office at that meeting and keeping you informed?
Yes, that would be why he was there.
And we also see V13A, from whom we expect to hear in the inquiry for PHE. And then if we move over to page 2 and item 6, we have a situation update. And there it sets out 3 possible public health risk scenarios were discussed. These are deliberate external exposure, deliberate self-exposure, and accidental exposure. So at this stage, 6th of March 2018, from a public health perspective, the incident appearing to be at an early stage, as it wasn't known whether it was deliberate or accidental, because I think organophosphate had been identified, but blood tests were awaited. Does that sound
correct?
Right to you?
And we know that organophosphates are used in farming and gardening in some countries. So while we were concerned about the first bullet, you couldn't at that point rule out the second and third.
So we see further down in item 6, indications are that compound involved is complex and not easy to purchase, which now points to this being a deliberate exposure. No indication at present as to what the compound is. Discussions with DSTL will continue. And then item 7, included in the strategic aims, were to minimise the risk to the wider public and to support and deliver effective professional and public communications.
Yes.
And then item 8, PHE response. It's noted that need to establish route of exposure, oral dermal inhalation, so not known at this early stage. And then public health, if we could go further down, please. Public health risk is currently considered to be low. Close contacts presenting to Salisbury FT have been assessed and no symptoms of exposure and no indication of environmental contamination. However, need to gain a better understanding and provide evidence-based assessment.
Yes.
And then if we go on to item 9, SRG to continue on daily basis unless otherwise notified. In addition to PHE, this will include SG from NHS England and something from DHSC. And then further down to item 13, we see communication strategy. Public. The local police are leading on public communications. Local multi-agency comms cell to be convened at 11. PHE have not put out any specific communications using standard messages, for example, to call 111.
Yeah.
Is that something that just you're aware of as being a general response to incidents with medical concerns?
Yes, that you start locally until you know you need to go broader, and that the local public health and local hospital lead that.
And then item C there, noted need to provide some internal comms to staff, particularly at Porton, where site is closed to Salisbury and DSTL operational. Cross-government PHE communications are linking with DHSC and CSS. What's CSS?
It's in, at least in my day, it was in Cabinet Office. It's the bit that looks after, of government that looks after security. Can't remember what it stands for now.
Thank you. CSS communication teams and taking the lead from Home Office, all cross-government communications to go through DHSC. And then it says all PHE communications to be signed off by SD. I was wondering whether that's you or whether that's someone else or whether you know.
I would assume it's me, though normally it would say either my full initials, SCD, or CMO. Most normally CMO, but I would think it's that, and it would not be surprising. One of the things that I would bring to this would be a not being expert, looking at it in a broader perspective and questioning how it might be heard. So it doesn't surprise me.
So it doesn't surprise you, but would it be usual in a response to an emergency incident like this that you would expect PHE communications to be signed off by you?
I don't think we tested it for other national security issues. I looked at a number of their reports before they were published on other issues in order to advise them. So it wouldn't be the first time.
But would you have any objections if PHE were putting out messaging about public health without your sign-off on it in this sort of situation?
So there are two types of sign-off. If they're putting out something new, I should have been warned, known, whether it's policy or other. And when it's something sensitive, which this arguably was, then I would expect to have seen it before it went out.
Returning to your witness statement, and we can take that down now. Excuse me one moment. Thank you very much. My attention's been drawn to the fact that, of course, Jenny Harris's role was strategic director of PHE. Do you think SD could have meant strategic director in that circumstance, or do you
It
not
could
know?
well have done, yes.
Thank you. Returning to your witness statement, I'm at paragraph 16 for your reference, page 4. You said that the SRG minutes, those we've just looked at, noted the public health risk to be low. And this low risk to public health was the risk to the wider population, including the people of Salisbury. And this was communicated in public messaging on the 6th of March and thereafter. And we'll come to the public messages in a moment, but you go on to say, however, it was recognised by PHE staff that there was potential risk to individuals if they accessed an area that was contaminated. So do you recall if that was the particular concern at that stage when not much was known, but you were looking at the possibility of organophosphates?
It's difficult for me to be certain, but it seems clear that if you have an event like this and you're worrying that it was not, whether it's accidental or not accidental, you would worry about exposure of others in the vicinity to where the poison had likely been.
So I'm going to come on to the public messaging, but I'm conscious of the time, and I wonder if this would be a moment to break for lunch.
If it's convenient to you, Ms. Whitelaw, I expect it's convenient to the rest of us. Will an hour take us, enable everything that needs doing to be done?
Yes, I think so. I'm not gaining any other indications.
Then 10 to 2, please. Sally, you're in the middle of giving your evidence, of course, but we'd like you back, please, at 10 to 2. Keep your own counsel in the meantime.
Thank you.
Otherwise.